Diplomatic tension appears to be escalating between Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump. Trump has just uninvited Carney from his so-called Board of Peace. The president posting about it on social media last night. His withdrawal following Carney's second major speech this week, in which he rebuked Trump's veiled threats against Canada at the World Economic Forum. Carney spoke yesterday at the Liberal cabinet retreat in Quebec City.
Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership in the economy, in security, and in rich cultural exchange. But Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian.
All right, to dig deeper into this, we've reached Scott Lucas. He's a professor of international politics at University College Dublin, joining us from Wicklow, Ireland. Thank you for making the time.
Hey everyone, Daniel here. Welcome home. So what just happened, guys? At a packed Trump rally, the roaring crowd suddenly went dead silent as Trump stopped mid-sentence, turned around, and began walking and pacing while staring at a section behind the stage. Thousands held their breath, all asking the same question. What just happened? What happened was this. Somewhere in that sea of bodies, a woman collapsed. Right there behind the stage, hidden from the cameras but not from the people around her. Voices started shouting almost immediately, "Medic! Doctor! We need help over here!" The sound of those calls cut through the rally noise like a knife, and Trump heard them. He heard them, and he responded instantly. No hesitation, no trying to power through and pretend nothing was wrong. He stopped everything. He pointed toward the commotion and asked a question that sounded like it came straight out of another era. "Is there a doctor in the house, please?" Those words, that phrase, it is so old-fashioned, so movie.
Thank you.
A lot to talk about here with this late-breaking news last night that Trump was going to withdraw his invitation to Carney to join the Board of Peace. What do you make of this move?
So let me get this straight. Mark Carney had already said, or Canada had already said, they weren't going to come to Trump's party anyway. They were washing their hair, or they had better things to do than go to, effectively, a symbolic event called the Board of Peace, which is more about Trump's ego than it's actually about peace. And then Trump decides, oh, I'm going to be the one that set the news agenda by saying, oh, I don't want you here anyway. I don't want you in my party. I mean, that's effectively what happened. I don't want to be too flippant about this. I think there are serious issues to discuss here, given what has happened at Davos this week, given the turmoil inside Washington domestically as well as their foreign policy, and given the very important speech that Mark Carney made yesterday.
Script perfect that it froze the moment in a way nothing else could have. This wasn't a teleprompter line. This wasn't a rehearsed response. This was a man in the middle of a live performance realizing that something real was happening, something that mattered more than the speech he was giving, and reacting accordingly. The crowd, which seconds earlier had been a wall of noise, went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next line, the heavy, anxious quiet of people who are worried about someone in their midst. Trump paced. He watched. He waited while first responders pushed through the crowd, while medical staff did their work, while the woman was checked and stabilized and eventually helped out of the venue. The whole thing lasted several minutes of near total silence at what is normally one of the loudest events in American politics. Think about that. A Trump rally silent. That almost never happens. These events are built on noise, on chanting, on cheering, on the constant feedback loop between the stage and the floor. When that noise stops...
About, Canadian identity and Canadian values. But Trump here is just simply throwing a tantrum because, number one, he was upstaged at Davos by Mark Carney's speech. Number two, because he had to bail out of trying to seize Greenland, in part because of the unified front of Canada and the European powers. And three, because his Board of Peace show was pretty much a flop, with only about 23 countries signing on, only 2 of them coming from Europe.
There's been a lot of talk coming out of Mark Carney's initial speech in Davos and his trip before that to China and Qatar about some of the gains that were made over the last week for Carney's administration, but also some of the damage that may have been done over the last week, particularly when it comes to his relationship with the White House. As we
It is genuinely jarring. It is the kind of thing that makes people stop scrolling and pay attention. And that is exactly what happened when video of this moment started spreading across social media. Because silence at a Trump rally is about as unusual as silence at a rock concert. It just doesn't happen. And when it does, people notice. The event was held in Hebron, Kentucky, at a logistics warehouse that had been converted into a rally venue for the afternoon. These industrial spaces have become a signature of Trump's events, big, open floors that can pack in thousands of supporters in a way that feels raw and unfiltered, nothing like the polished arenas where most politicians hold their events. The crowd was large. The energy was high. Trump was working through his usual mix of policy talk and political attacks, doing exactly what his team has trained him to do at these rallies, keeping that direct connection to the base alive even as his second term moves forward. And then the woman collapsed. Now we don't know all the
been talking about over those last two speeches now. Canadians are hearing different signals. We have Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick spends a lot of time with Trump. We're also hearing from U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra, who is speaking with David Common. Let's just take a moment and listen to what they had to say.
They have the second best deal in the world. And all I got to do is listen to this guy whine and complain.
I think it's great that the president and the prime minister have developed a good relationship. This would be a great topic for them to get on the phone and work through it and talk through it. We've got a lot of decisions in front of us.
Okay, so sort of two different takeaways from all that's happened over the last week. What's your take on how much damage has been done and where the relationship sits right now?
All right, let me put this into a wider context. First of all, in the specifics, so Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, the same guy who went to Davos and said
details of what caused it, whether it was the heat inside that packed warehouse, whether she had been standing for hours without enough water, whether there was some underlying medical condition that chose that exact moment to become a problem. What we know is that people around her reacted instantly. Voices started calling out for help, and the sound of those calls traveled through the crowd and reached the stage. Trump heard them. He stopped. He turned. He looked. And then he did exactly what you would hope someone in his position would do. He called for help. He stepped aside. He let the medical professionals do their jobs. And here is where a fascinating detail enters the story. Dr. Mehmet Oz was at the rally. Yes, that Dr. Oz, the television doctor who turned politician, who now serves as the administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the Trump administration. He was in the crowd when the woman collapsed, and he walked over to where the first responders were working and joined them. The nation's top Medicare and Medicaid official, the man who oversees health.
Look, NATO relies on us, the U.S. We get to say what happens. Whose comments on Europe were so provocative that there was a walkout at a dinner, a walkout that included Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank, Howard Lutnick, in an administration that has shown utmost arrogance, calling Mark Carney arrogant. This is part of the Trump temper tantrum, and it needs to be recognized as such. In terms of the practical effect, look, that trade deal, initially NAFTA, now USMCA, it is a very important trade deal, but it's the Trump folks who have threatened to walk out on it. It's not Canada threatening to walk out on it. This is an attempt to bully the Canadians. Now, Pete Hoekstra has put a different view in that speech that you heard about, which is, look, there's a way of working together. We can make a deal. But only a few days ago, Pete Hoekstra was also saying that the U.S. doesn't need Canada. So,
healthcare for tens of millions of Americans crouched down on the floor of a Kentucky warehouse to help a rally attendee who had collapsed. That image is something. Whether you find it reassuring or strange or somewhere in between, you have to admit it is not something you see every day at a political event. The woman who collapsed had a doctor on the scene. Not just any doctor, but a famous one who happened to be the head of a massive federal agency. And he helped. By all accounts, she was stabilized, she was helped out of the venue, and she was going to be okay. Trump later thanked the medical team and thanked Dr. Oz publicly, and the crowd, visibly relieved, applauded. But then came the moment that everyone is still talking about. Because once it was clear the woman was all right, once the relief had settled over the room, Trump walked back to the microphone. And instead of just picking up where he left off, instead of making some sober acknowledgement of what had just happened and moving on, he went for the joke. He blamed California Governor Gavin Newsom. He said, and I'm paraphrasing because the exact wording varies across different reports, that he must have mentioned Newsom's name right before the woman fainted, that the very sound of Newsom's name was apparently enough to make someone collapse. The crowd lost it. They laughed. They cheered. The energy that had drained out of that room during those long, tense minutes came rushing back almost instantly. 30 seconds. That's all it took, from anxious silence to roaring laughter in half a minute. Trump had done what he does better than almost anyone. He had read the room, felt the emotional temperature, and deployed exactly the right tool to bring the crowd back to where he needed them to be. Now let's slow down and really unpack what happened in that Kentucky warehouse, because the 30-second video clips that spread across social media don't tell the whole story. They show Trump pausing. They show him looking around. They show the crowd going quiet, but they don't capture what it felt like to be in that room, and they don't capture the full context of why this moment unfolded the way it did. So let's walk through it carefully from the beginning and make sure the full picture is clear. The rally was held at a place called Verse Logistics in Hebron, Kentucky, a warehouse-style venue just outside Cincinnati, basically in northern Kentucky. These industrial spaces have become Trump's preferred type of rally venue for this phase of his presidency. They are big, open, and industrial. They can pack thousands of people in close together, creating a sense of intensity and energy that more polished venues just don't provide. There are no luxury boxes, no corporate suites, no separation between the stage and the floor. Everyone is packed in together, standing shoulder to shoulder, all facing the same direction, all focused on the same man. The rally was scheduled for the mid-afternoon, but by the time Trump took the stage, it was around 5:15 in the evening local time. The crowd had been waiting for hours. They had been standing, cheering, chanting, feeding off each other's energy. By the time the main event started, the room was already at a fever pitch, the kind of atmosphere where you can feel the electricity in the air, where every word from the stage lands like a thunderclap because the crowd is already primed and ready. Trump was doing what Trump does at these events, working through his talking points, firing up the base, going after political opponents, getting the crowd going with the rhythms and cadences that his supporters know by heart. Standard rally energy, loud, packed, electric, the kind of event that his team has turned into a science, with every pause and every punchline timed for maximum impact. And then, somewhere in the middle of all that noise and energy, something shifted. A woman in the crowd behind the stage collapsed. We don't have all the specifics about what caused it. Maybe it was the heat inside that packed venue. Maybe she had been standing for too long without enough water. Maybe there was a pre-existing medical condition that chose that exact moment to become a problem. But whatever the cause, the effect was immediate and unmistakable. People around her started shouting for help. "Medic! Doctor! We need help over here!" Those voices cut through the rally noise like a blade, and the people closest to the commotion turned to see what was happening. The sound of those calls reached the stage, and Trump heard them. You can see it in the video if you watch closely. He stops talking mid-sentence. He turns his head toward the direction of the noise. He looks out into the crowd, trying to see what is happening. He doesn't try to talk over the commotion. He doesn't try to power through and pretend nothing is wrong. He stops completely. He lets the moment breathe. And then he says the words that have become the most remembered line from this entire event. "Is there a doctor in the house, please?" That line, that specific, almost old-fashioned phrase, it lands exactly the way it needs to land in that moment. It signals to everyone in the room that something real is happening, that it needs to be taken seriously, and that the event is going to pause until the situation is handled. It also has the effect of freezing the moment in time because it is the kind of thing you hear in movies, not at political rallies. It is the kind of thing a character says in a scene set 60 years ago. But Trump said it genuinely, without any apparent hesitation or performance, and it worked. The noise in the room dropped. The cheering stopped. The chanting stopped. Even the side conversation seemed to fade away. Thousands of people turned toward where the woman had fallen, and the room went into that unusual, heavy silence that rally crowds are almost never in. It was the silence of worry, the silence of people watching and waiting and hoping that everything would be okay. And here is where Dr. Oz enters the picture, because Oz, who was at the event in his capacity as the administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, was in the crowd when the woman collapsed, and when the calls for help went out, he moved. He walked toward the scene. He joined the first responders who were already there, crouching down next to a collapsed rally attendee on the floor of a Kentucky warehouse. Let's sit with that image for a moment, because it is genuinely striking. The head of the agency that runs Medicare and Medicaid for the entire country, the man who sets reimbursement rates, shapes coverage policy, and makes decisions that affect the health care of tens of millions of Americans, is on his knees on a warehouse floor, helping a woman who fainted at a political rally. On one level, it is reassuring. The woman collapsed, and there were medics on site immediately, which is standard for any large event. But also, the country's top Medicare and Medicaid official happened to be a physician who was physically present and willing to help. In pure medical terms, having Dr. Oz on the scene was probably a good thing for that woman in that moment. Now, whether you have opinions about Oz's television career or his politics or his qualifications for his current government role, in that specific moment, an additional set of medically trained hands was available and showed up. The woman was stabilized. She was helped out of the venue. By all available accounts, she was okay. Trump later thanked the medical team and thanked Dr. Oz publicly, and the crowd, visibly relieved, applauded. The tension that had been gripping the room started to dissolve. People exhaled. The worried whispers faded. The worst had been avoided. But then came the moment that really defines this story, the moment that people are going to remember and talk about long after the details of the medical incident have faded from memory. Because once it was clear the woman was going to be all right, once the relief had settled over the crowd, Trump walked back to the microphone, and instead of just picking up where he left off, instead of making a sober acknowledgement of what had just happened and moving on, he went for the laugh. He blamed Gavin Newsom. He said, and the exact wording varies slightly across different reports, but the substance is consistent, that he must have been talking about Newsom right when the woman fainted, that just hearing the name Newsom was apparently enough to make somebody collapse. The implication was clear, and the delivery was timed perfectly. Trump was joking that Newsom is so terrible, so unpopular, so objectionable, that even the mention of his name could cause physical harm. The crowd lost it. They laughed, they cheered. The energy that had drained out of that room during those long, tense minutes came rushing back almost instantly. 30 seconds from anxious silence to roaring laughter. The rally was back on track. Trump had done what he does. He had read the room, felt the emotional temperature, and deployed exactly the right tool to bring the crowd back to where he needed them to be. But here is where things get complicated, because depending on your perspective, that joke lands very differently. If you are a Trump supporter in that room or watching at home, it is probably funny. It is classic Trump. Dark adjacent humor deployed at exactly the right moment to break the tension and get the crowd re-engaged. It is the kind of thing his supporters genuinely love about him. The willingness to be irreverent, to be a little edgy, to not take every moment with maximum seriousness. And in terms of pure crowd management, in terms of the mechanics of keeping a room full of thousands of people emotionally regulated after a tense medical incident, it worked. It worked very effectively. The crowd went from worry to silence to laughter in about 30 seconds. That is actually a hard thing to pull off, and Trump did it without apparently thinking twice about it. But if you are not a Trump supporter, if you are watching that clip from a more critical distance, the Newsom joke probably landed differently. It probably felt like an inappropriate pivot away from what had been a genuinely scary moment for the woman involved and for the people around her. It probably felt like he was using someone's medical emergency as a punchline about a political rival, and that is a totally fair reaction to have. Both of those readings of the same moment can be true simultaneously. Trump's base sees irreverent humor under pressure as a feature. His critics see the same behavior as a failure of basic empathy and decorum. That gap, that fundamental disagreement about what the moment meant and how it should have been handled, is not something that is going to get resolved by any amount of analysis. It is baked into the tribal nature of how people relate to Trump at this point in his presidency. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because this moment in Kentucky is not happening in isolation. It is part of a pattern, part of a specific kind of event that has become a defining feature of Trump's political identity. And understanding that pattern helps explain why a few minutes of silence at a rally became a story that traveled around the world. This is not actually the first time something like this has happened at a Trump rally. Fainting incidents at large political events, especially at Trump rallies, which tend to be long, loud, and held in large venues that are not always optimally climate controlled, have happened before. They have happened at events for other politicians too. Large crowds, long-standing times, high emotional energy, sometimes inadequate hydration. These are conditions that lead to people fainting. It is not unique to Trump or to his supporters. But because Trump rallies are such a specific and intensely covered kind of event, and because Trump himself is such a specific and intensely covered kind of person, these moments get a level of attention and scrutiny that they would not get at a standard political gathering. A fainting incident at a routine congressional town hall might get a brief mention in the local news. A fainting incident at a Trump rally becomes a national story, analyzed and debated and clipped and shared across every platform. That is the reality of being the most covered political figure in American history. Everything gets magnified. Everything means something. And so these moments end up becoming part of the broader narrative about what Trump rallies are, what they feel like, and what they say about the people who attend them and the person they are there to support. That is worth thinking about honestly, without either romanticizing or dismissing what these rallies actually are. Because love them or hate them, they are a phenomenon. Tens of thousands of Americans keep showing up to these events months and months into a second term when there is no election to win and no campaign to run. They are not there because they need to be persuaded. They are there because they want to be there. They are there because being in that room, in that crowd, feeling that energy is an experience they value. What are they looking for? What do they leave with? Those are the questions that moments like this one open up. A woman faints. The crowd goes silent. Trump stops and responds. Dr. Oz crouches down to help. The woman is okay. Trump makes a joke about Gavin Newsom. The crowd laughs. The rally continues. On the surface, it is a simple sequence of events, but underneath that surface, there are currents of meaning that tell you something real about where this country is and where it might be heading. Let's talk about what Trump's response in that moment actually reveals about him as a communicator and as someone who reads a crowd. And I want to be clear about something here. I am saying this regardless of where you stand politically, because this is just an observation about how the man operates. When the woman collapsed and the room went quiet, Trump did not freeze. He did not fumble around awkwardly looking for what to say. He did not try to keep talking and pretend nothing was happening. He stopped immediately. He assessed the situation. He called for medical help clearly and directly. He gave the room permission to pause by pausing himself. That is actually competent crowd management in a crisis moment. That is the kind of instinct that comes from spending decades in front of large audiences, first in entertainment, then in politics. He knew that the crowd needed him to acknowledge what was happening before they could process it and move on. He knew that if he tried to keep talking over the commotion, if he tried to pretend nothing was wrong, the room would have felt wrong. The energy would have stayed off. The connection between the stage and the floor would have broken, so he paused. He called for help. He waited. And the room waited with him. That is not nothing. In a political environment where so many public figures seem robotic and scripted, where every word is focus grouped and every gesture is rehearsed, Trump's ability to be present in the moment, to respond to what is actually happening in the room rather than what is written on the teleprompter, is genuinely rare. It is part of why his supporters connect with him the way they do. They feel like they are getting the real person, not the polished product. And then there is the Newsom joke. This is where it gets more complicated and more revealing about the specific culture of Trump's political world. The joke worked in the room. Full stop. The crowd laughed. The tension broke. The energy came back. From a pure performance standpoint, from the standpoint of someone trying to manage the emotional temperature of a room full of thousands of people who just went through a scary few minutes, it was effective. The crowd needed permission to stop worrying, to let go of the tension, to get back into rally mode. Trump gave them that permission in the form of a joke. It was quick, it was sharp, it landed. But effectiveness is not the only lens worth applying here. Because the joke was made at the expense of a woman who had just collapsed on the floor of a venue and had to be helped out by first responders. She was okay, and that matters enormously. But she was not yet okay when Trump made the joke. The situation was still unfolding. The first responders were still doing their work. And deploying someone's medical emergency as a political punchline, even gently, even with apparent good humor, says something about priorities. It says that the political point, the jab at Newsom, the crowd laugh, the momentum recovery, was the immediate instinct. Not a beat of quiet reflection. Not a simple, we are glad she is okay and we wish her well. Straight to the joke. That gap between what Trump's base finds charming and what his critics find troubling is as wide as ever. That is not a new observation, but moments like this one make it very concrete and very visible. The same action is seen as quick-witted by some and callous by others. There is no neutral ground. There is no way to split the difference. You either think he handled it well or you think he handled it poorly, and which side you come down on probably depends on how you already feel about him. Now let's talk about Dr. Oz, because his presence at the rally and his involvement in the medical response raises a genuinely interesting set of questions that are worth taking seriously. Oz is not just a celebrity doctor at this point. He is the administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is one of the most consequential and powerful positions in the entire federal healthcare apparatus. CMS administers Medicare and Medicaid for tens of millions of Americans. It sets reimbursement rates. It shapes coverage policy. It makes decisions that affect the healthcare of a significant portion of the United States population. And the person running that agency, a former television personality who is not a career health administrator, was at a political rally in Kentucky. And when a supporter collapsed, he was the one crouching down to help. On a human level, that is fine. That is good. Actually, a doctor helping someone in medical distress is a good thing, regardless of who that doctor is or what job they currently holds. But it also raises a question about what it says when the nation's top Medicare and Medicaid official is at a political event in the first place, and what it says more broadly about how the Trump administration has integrated political loyalty and public health leadership in ways that previous administrations did not. That is a conversation worth having, not a reason to be angry at anyone for helping a sick person, but a context worth being aware of. The image of Dr. Oz on the floor of that warehouse is striking because it captures something about how this administration operates, how the lines between governance and politics, between public service and political loyalty, have been blurred in ways that feel new and different. Whether that blurring is a good thing or a bad thing depends on your perspective, but pretending it isn't happening is not helpful. The bottom line on the Kentucky rally is this: a woman collapsed. Trump stopped and responded quickly and appropriately in the immediate crisis. Dr. Oz and first responders helped stabilize her, and she was okay. Trump made a joke that brought the crowd back to life, and the rally continued. The whole thing lasted a few minutes of real tension, and then it was over. In the grand scheme of things, in terms of immediate consequences, nothing terrible happened. The woman was all right. The rally went on. The moment got covered and analyzed and clipped and shared, and now it is part of the ongoing story of what Trump's presidency looks and feels like from the inside of his own rallies. And that story, what it feels like to be in that room, is actually something that most political coverage does not spend enough time on. What is the energy? What does it mean that tens of thousands of Americans keep showing up to these events months and months into a second term when there is no election to win and no campaign to run? What are they looking for? What do they leave with? Those are the questions that this strange, tense, silent, then laughing few minutes in a Kentucky warehouse actually opens up. And they are questions worth sitting with for a while, because the answers tell you something real about where this country is and where it might be heading.